We are joined from Beijing by Xu Zitao. He is the chief economist for the financial consulting group Deloitte China. Joining us from New York is Robert Hormat. He is the vice chairman of Kissinger Associates, an international consulting firm. He's taken part in previous China-U.S. talks. And joining us from Shanghai is Xiao Chuing. She is with the Shanghai Institutes of International Studies and is the Deputy Director of the Institute for Taiwan, Hong Kong and Macau Studies. Welcome to all of you to the show. Yu Chuing, let me start with you. Give us a sense of how important these talks are between officials from China and the United States.
The SNED dialogue, of course, this mechanism is so far the most important one for China and the United States to come together, to sit together, to talk about various issues that related to this bilateral relations. And every year, almost all of the departments, the head of the departments of both two governments come together and talk about a lot of issues. So you know that all these bilateral issues, they have a lot of domestic implications. So domestic policies have a lot of impact on this bilateral relations. So for these government officials sit together, they can coordinate their policies better than they decide their policies on each side. So SNED is a very good platform for the two governments to talk about, to have a dialogue. And especially before President Xi Jinping's visit in this coming September, I think both two sides have a lot to discuss at this time.
I want to talk about that visit in a moment, but Zitao, the Chinese vice premier, Wang Yang, he wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal in which he said that the intention is to solve problems in a more collaborative and cooperative way. And I'm just wondering, when we have meetings like this, are the two sides actually coming to these meetings emphasizing their common interests rather than what actually divides them?
Yeah, I think these two economies are extremely complementary. And notwithstanding some of the issues, for example, geopolitical issues, exchange rate. But I think the big picture-wise, these two countries are just extremely, they have extremely economic complementary relationship. So that's why Vice Premier Wang Yang addressed those issues on Wall Street Journal. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Robert, what does the United States hope to see from these dialogue talks?
Well, I think the previous two speakers have been very clear and very correct that this is a very important dialogue because it enables the various agencies, the heads of the various agencies or senior officials in the various agencies to talk to one another in a large group so they can coordinate, they can identify areas where progress can be made, for instance, in the environment where progress has been made in the last several meetings, but they can also identify areas of difference and work on those and try to narrow those differences. With respect to this meeting in particular, I don't expect any dramatic results, in part because, as your guest indicated a moment ago, there's going to be a state visit by President Xi Jinping in September, and any of the big agreements that these sides might be working toward will be announced there and not here. But a lot of the preparatory work can be done in these conversations.
Zitao, the focus is on trade and investment. There have been talks in the past over the possibility of a bilateral investment treaty between the two sides. What are your thoughts on that? Could we see some progress?
Yes, we are going to see some progress, but I don't see a miracle. I think from China's perspective, the view is very clear. U.S. should have a more sort of open-door policy for Chinese investment. But of course, from U.S. perspective, I think it's going to be difficult. So I think some progress will be made, but I don't foresee a miracle.
Yu Chuing, we know that the focus will be on trade and on economics and that relationship, but ultimately is this driven a lot by politics? I mean, one of the issues that has been mentioned already is the fact that we could see progress being made on climate change. There is a very important climate change conference coming up in Paris later. So what is the political relationship here and what kind of impact is it having on these talks?
On the climate change issue, actually, during the last visit of President Obama to China, at the end of last year, actually, both two sides have signed the joint statement on climate change, which shows that the two sides have been working very hard, trying their best to reduce carbon emission. And China is the biggest developing country, and United States is the biggest developed country. So these two countries now, they have to show the implementation of this issue. So they have to do something and to let the other countries know that they mean it. They are trying their best to do what they should do on this climate change issue. So now they should lead by model. If they can really do something, then it will be very good for the Paris conference at the end of this year to make some real progress, because all the countries, both in the developing countries, the developed country, these two camps, they are watching China and the United States.
Robert, both the Chinese Vice Premier Wang Yang as well as the U.S. Vice President Biden addressed the issue of communication and cooperation. Let's take a listen to what both of them had to say at the beginning of the conference.
And we need to be honest and direct about where we've been, what lies on the horizon for the relationship that will in many ways define the 21st century for the remainder of the world.
Some even want China and the United States to confront each other. In any case, decision makers of both countries must always remember that confrontation is a negative-sum game in which both sides pay a heavy price, and the world will suffer too.
So, Robert, what we're hearing is definitely a recognition that confrontation between these two countries will negatively impact both countries.
I think that's quite correct. I don't think there's anything that can be done on a global scale on trade or investment, the environment, or maritime issues or anything else that can be done without the cooperation of the United States and China. These are the two biggest countries, the two most powerful countries in the world, and if something is to happen globally, those two are going to have to agree in general, at least on the outlines and the principles. Now, obviously, other countries have to participate as well. China and the U.S. can't run the world alone, but they can certainly set the stage for a lot of progress in the climate area or in others as well. On the question of the bilateral investment treaty that was mentioned a moment ago, that I think is a very important area. As you know, the U.S. is negotiating the TPP with some colleagues and some partners in the Pacific. China is engaged in a negotiation of a similar nature called RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. So those are being done on a regional basis, but separately. The one major negotiation now on the economic side is on the investment treaty, and I think that will be very important that it be a high-level investment treaty. The American business community would like certain assurances about their treatment they receive in China to make sure they get the benefits of the same kind of treatment that Chinese companies get. The Chinese want a clear idea of the terms and conditions of their investment here. If this works, and they do come up with a really good agreement, that will further strengthen economic ties, and there'll be higher-end American investment in China because American companies would feel confident about, which they need, investment and intellectual property protection and other things. Chinese companies will feel more comfortable with the political environment here. Chinese companies invested $15 billion last year. That number can go up, but that is going to be very important bilaterally, and it can also set a framework perhaps for other countries in the way they negotiate future bilateral investment treaties. So we set a model if we can make progress for the rest of the world.
Sitar, we just heard there from Robert about some of the concerns that American companies have, American companies that want to invest in China. What are the concerns that Chinese companies have wanting to invest in the United States?
Yeah, well, there are a lot of concerns. I mean, if you look at this relationship on the trade side, we have seen so much progress. But China has a very large trade surplus. Now, if you study this is just basic economics 101 or counting And given China's large trade surplus, so you must allow Chinese companies to invest in the United States. Otherwise, book cannot be balanced. But the reality right now is in so many sectors right now, the door is very much closed. I don't want to repeat some of the phrases from the Congress report on Huawei and the ZTE. So I do believe there's a genuine concern on the China side whether U.S. would have opened a policy for Chinese investment. I hope progress be made.
One of the things we have heard, or in fact two of the things that we've heard Sitao about Chinese concerns are the fact that the Americans have placed very stringent security conditions on Chinese investment in the United States. That's one. The other is that it's very, very difficult for Chinese businessmen to get visas to come to the United States to conduct their business. Do you expect to see progress on these two issues?
Oh, yeah. I think on the visa front, I believe U.S. Embassy is working very, very hard. I think they have introduced various fast-track program, progress already being made. But in one area, given the fact, at least for the foreseeable future, China would remain as a transition economy, I think sometimes the regulation rules towards Chinese investment, particularly to look at Chinese companies on the basis of state-owned company subsidies. I think some of these rules, some of these conditionalities are just rather rigid. So I genuinely hope there will be open door policy on the U.S. side. But on the visa front, I think a lot of progress already being made.
Yu Cheng, you mentioned earlier on that a lot of what's being done right now will lay the groundwork for that visit by President Xi Jinping later. So should we be looking at certain pointers from these meetings to give us an indication of what is going to be announced, what is going to be achieved when the president comes here?
I think for this SNED dialogue, it has made preparation for President Xi Jinping's coming visit to the United States, because this visit is the first state visit of President Xi to the United States. So both two sides paid a lot of attention to this visit. Hope this visit will be a successful one. So actually the two sides announced the visit quite long time ago, several months ago. So we know that right now the atmosphere within Washington, D.C. is not very good. Some noise is coming out of the so-called China threat, a kind of China would challenge the United States dominance in the world. So this kind of a voice is coming out. So I think this SNED, actually the tone is that the two sides should cooperate, not only on the global level, but also on the regional and bilateral level. So this tone, I think this, if we have quite many fruits coming out of this SNED, and it would help to improve the atmosphere in the United States and try to prepare for Xi Jinping's visit. And also we know that during the summit, the schedule will be very tight for both two presidents. So all these difficult issues have to be solved before that. And for other things that the two sides, I think the two leaders can push very hard and try to see whether they can have real fruits coming out during the summit. So that's why this SNED dialogue is very, very important to prepare for President Xi Jinping's visit to the United States.